Hi there, Nigel from NBW-Graphics here, and here is Kanchanaburi. Got some notes with me this time. Being a silly old bastard, I just cannot remember all these Thai names. Do my head in, as well as twisting my tongue. Anyway, I digress. I decided in the end to get a car from the hotel, Taipan Hotel in Bangkok, to a hotel in Kanchanaburi. That took about 2 hours compared with the train journey. So let me run through the pros and cons. Costs a bit more to... Oh, here we go again. Tongue twisted. Cost a bit more, but here's the advantages. For a start, I didn't get to bed until like 2 o'clock in the morning. One of these unplanned things. I went into a local restaurant, sat down, had a meal, and one of the waitresses came over and said hello to me, and we got chatting. Turned out she'd worked there for the last 12 years. So that she's worked there from before I went to live in Thailand 10 years ago. And she remembers me from all my visits. So, needless to say, bought her a few drinks and we had a very entertaining evening. Most enjoyable, and the food. So back to the hotel, packed the bag, got into bed. In the morning, car arrives 10 o'clock. Now, it took us 2 hours. Caught up on a bit of sleep during that 2 hours. And I was in my hotel room at Kanchanaburi. Whereas, if I'd got the train, I'd have had to have got a taxi from the Taipan to Thonburi Station, otherwise known as Bangkok Noi. If you decide to go this route, I'd advise you to see if the train stops at the River Choir Bridge station before it gets to Kanchanaburi station. That will save you a taxi ride from Kanchanaburi station into town. Of course, this depends where your hotel is situated, but these days you go online, it's all on the map anyway, so you'll be able to work it out. So, without further ado, let me take you into the history and show you what it was all about and the purpose of my 5-day visit. One of the most extraordinary engineering achievements of World War II was the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway. With unbelievable primitive tools for such a project and a total disregard for human life and suffering, the Japanese built a railway 415 kilometers long through one of the most rugged and pestilence-ridden areas in the world, in the incredibly short span of 12 months. The cost was a life for every sleeper laid over the most difficult sections. The Japanese were aware that the British had surveyed a proposed railway linking Burma and Thailand in 1910, and that they had abandoned the project in 1912 because of the difficult terrain, endemic diseases and high monsoonal rainfall. A plan for the railway was drawn up in June 1942, and Death Railway Order No. 1 was issued by the Imperial Japanese Army. The 1 metre gauge railway line was to follow the same route as the British had previously proposed. Japanese troops celebrate the fall of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942. On that day, led by a Japanese officer, Lieutenant General Arthur Ernest Percival, on the right, walks under a flag of truce to negotiate the capitulation of Allied forces in Singapore. More than 60,000 British and other Commonwealth and Empire troops surrendered to an Imperial Army force of around 35,000. Winston Churchill, when he heard the news, called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Prisoners of war in Selarang Barracks, Changi, Singapore. One of the 50-metre atap huts used to accommodate up to 250 prisoners of war in Changi. Other prisoners were housed in the former British barracks as seen in the last photograph. All the accommodation was grossly overcrowded, but was infinitely superior to that provided for prisoners of war sent to Burma, Thailand and elsewhere. Closed steel rice trucks in which prisoners were transported from Changi to Thailand. There were 36 men to a truck, and the journey took 5 days. Men and their gear were so tightly packed that sleep was possible only in shifts. By day the prisoners stifled in the overheated steel trucks, and by night they froze. Toilet facilities were non-existent apart from occasional stops, and food consisted of 2 small meals a day. A Japanese guard travelled in each truck and occupied a position near the partly closed sliding door, which was the only source of ventilation. Asian workers on the railway at Whampoa siding, Thailand in October 1945. No one knows just how many civilian labourers died on the railway, but the official history of the 2nd 29th Battalion records that of the 270,000 Asians impressed to work on the railway line, only some 30,000 were ever traced or repatriated after the Japanese surrender. Add to this the deaths of all the Allied POWs, and you can understand why it is said, a life for every sleeper. Asian workers on the roof of a Burma-bound train in Thailand. Building the railway was a horrifying experience for most of the slaves employed on it. After its completion, travelling on parts of it could be equally terrifying. On one long viaduct, the speed limit was 5 kilometers an hour, and derailments along the length of the line were frequent. Originally planned to transport 3,000 tons daily, the target reached was about 1,000 tons. This interior is typical of a 180-metre atap roofed hut that was transported to various camps along the River Kwai. Bamboo supports were cut from the local jungle, and the whole structure was held together by ties stripped from the bark of certain trees. Sleeping space for each man was about 2.5 feet in width. A prisoner of war rice carrying party at Kanchanaburi, Thailand. The general condition of the prisoners and the fact that the photograph has been taken quite openly suggests that the picture may have been taken at the conclusion of hostilities. By this time food supplies were plentiful, although most of the men were barefooted and reduced to wearing laplaps. Prisoners of war grinding rice for pap, which was a watery boiled rice usually served for breakfast. Lunch consisted mainly of firmer boiled rice, while dinner was generally a cup of boiled rice and watery vegetable soup. A latrine at a POW camp designed so that waste matter assists garden cultivation. The condition of the prisoners suggests that the picture may have been taken at the end of hostilities. POWs putting down sleepers and laying lines. This work was done quickly over flat country, but there was little of that in Burma and Thailand. When the lines were laid to a bridge or cutting, pressure on the prisoners always intensified. The Japanese engineers then began speedo tactics. Beatings proliferated, and men were overworked mercilessly for up to 18 hours a day. Line laying at Ronsai, with 70 kilometers to go to reach the Burma-Thailand border. A British-American force was engaged in this work and followed closely on those engaged in clearing jungle, building embankments, and cutting through hills and mountains. Meanwhile, Australian prisoners of war carrying sleepers in Burma 70 kilometers from the Thailand border. Any kind of mechanical equipment was rarely seen on the railway. The entire project was carried out by manpower, dynamite and primitive tools. Elephants were used extensively in Burma and Thailand during the construction of the railway. Their main task was to haul logs from the jungle. At Konyu, Australians were astonished to find themselves sharing the same narrow muddy track with 6 of these lumbering animals. When the Burmese drivers died of cholera, the elephants refused to perform heavy tasks, which were taken over by the prisoners of war. These 6 elephants bathed in a small creek upstream of Konyu camp, so that by the time the water reached the prisoners, it often resembled a thick soup. A barge transporting sick prisoners of war and stores on the River Kwai. Barges were an important form of transport during the construction of the railway, but during the monsoon months, which started at the end of May, the river rose so high and flowed so fast that operation of barges ceased. Because of this, upriver camps were unable to receive vital food supplies. Asian labourers carrying sleepers at Tak An Un. The man on the left appears to be wearing a rice sack and has an ulcerated foot. Ulcers on the feet and legs were common among prisoners of war and led to many amputations. Hideous ulcers caused many amputations on the Burma-Thailand railway. These men were wearing artificial limbs made in Changi by W.O. Arthur Puden of East Maitland, North South Wales. Construction of a bridge at Kon Ko Ita, which was the joining point of the lines extending from Bampont in Thailand and south from Tham Bai Yuso Yat in Burma. Prisoners dreaded the prospect of having to work on these structures, falls from which were usually fatal. The original wooden bridge, made famous by Pierre Buet's book The Bridge on the River Kwai, and 2 years later made into a blockbuster film, was given to look like this, whereas in the reality its visible appearance was not as grand as can be seen in this picture. What many fail to appreciate is that there were not one but 2 bridges that spanned the River Kwai in the Second World War. The original wooden bridge was completed in February 1943, and the first train crossed the 11-span steel and concrete bridge as seen today in June of the same year. This steel and concrete bridge was the spoils of war when plundered by the Japanese from an oil field in Java and transported in pieces to Kanchanaburi, and the wooden bridge was about 300 metres downstream from its metal counterpart. Allied bombing raids to destroy the two Kanchanaburi bridges began in late 1944, but it was not until February 1945 that both were temporarily knocked out by the RAF Liberators of Air Command Southeast Asia. The wooden service bridge was finally destroyed on the 2nd of April 1945 by B-24 Bombardier Lieutenant Bill Henderson, United States Air Force. History would have you believe that the wooden bridge is no more. Perhaps history is correct. But approximately 300 meters downstream from its steel brother, on the Kanchanaburi side of the River Kwai, are the remains of a bridge going into the riverside bank, and situated in the museum. The museum is easy to find, not far from the bridge, and not everyone has a train in their front entrance with a car parked on top of it. On board the train, complete with my Farang tourist train ticket, I am going to Tham Krasi Bridge, also known as the Whampoa Viaduct, that is between Tham Krasi Bridge Station and Tham Krasi Station. Confusing or what? In March and April 1943, the 2,000 POWs and Romusha, Japanese word for labourer, built this viaduct in just 17 days. It is 400 metres in length. It hugs the cliff along the Kwai Noi and in places is 8 to 9 metres high. If you take a train from Kanchanaburi to Nam Tok, you will traverse this section of the track. The rail service is still running twice daily. Alternatively, or additionally, you may wish to walk the section of track between the two stations and get a better feel of what the POWs and Romusha endured in the blazing heat of this tropical climate. Almost all the wooden bridges on the railway have disappeared. The notable exception is the Whampoa Viaduct. The viaduct is still used today and maintained by the State Railway of Thailand. It has, however, been extensively repaired and strengthened. About 55 kilometres from Kanchanaburi, you can get off the train at Tham Krasi station and walk a very short distance back down the track that will bring you to the cave entrance, where Luang Po Buddha image is housed that the locals have respected for a very long time.
แกไปศิลปินเดียว อุ้ยยี่หัวไปเยอะ
Kanchanaburi War Cemetery is the largest of the three on the Burma-Siam Railway. It is located near the site of the Kanchanaburi Prison of War base camp, through which most prisoners passed through on their way to other camps. The cemetery, designed by Colin St. Clair Oakes, was created after the war by the Army Grave Service, who transferred graves into it from camp burial grounds and solitary sites all along the southern half of the railway and other sites in Thailand. 1939 to 1945. The land on which this cemetery stands is a gift of the Thai people for the perpetual resting place of the sailors, soldiers and airmen who are honoured here. In many of the camps, the dead were buried in hasty and unmarked graves, or cremated in open fires. But vengeance is the right of the victor, and the wartime triumphant Allies forced the Japanese to dig up every dead prisoner of war dumped in the jungle graves along the entire length of the Death Railway, and relocate their remains in one of the 3 designated cemeteries. Japanese engineers paying homage to their dead. Of the 13,000 engineers and guards on the railway, some 1,000 died. The ratio of deaths was approximately 1 in every 4 for prisoners of war, 1 in every 3 for Asian labourers, and 1 in every 13 for the Japanese. Outside the GF Museum stands a statue of Takashi Nagase. The acronym GF stands for the primary nationalities involved in the construction of the railway: Japanese, English, Australian, American, Thai, and Holland. Takashi Nagase, born in Okayama, Japan in 1918, was a university student before joining the army. Later the army sent him to work on the Death Railway as an interpreter for the Japanese military police. After World War II finished, he was one of the grave searching party looking for the graves of POWs that passed away during its construction. Because of this, he had a change of heart about the Japanese actions and devoted himself to society and became ordained as a Buddhist monk, dedicating merits to those who had departed, and established the River Kwai Peace Foundation that has given thousands of scholarships to the poor students in Kanchanaburi. During the Second World War, Eric Lomax, a British officer who was captured by the Japanese in Singapore and sent to a Japanese POW camp where he is forced to work on the Thai-Burma Railway. Eric is tortured by the Kempeitai, that is, Japanese military secret police, for building a radio receiver from spare parts. Apparently, he had fallen under suspicion for being a spy, for supposedly using British news broadcast receiver as a transmitter of military intelligence. In fact, however, his only intention had been to use the device as a morale booster for himself and his fellow prisoner slaves. Some 30 years after the war, Eric finds out that Takashi is working in Kanchanaburi as a tourist guide and returns to seek out Takashi for retribution, but events transpire somewhat differently than planned. Eric recalls these events in his book, The Railwayman, that subsequently became a film. The epilogue relates that Takashi and Eric remained friends until their deaths in 2011 and 2012 respectively.